Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Newhall. It's fantastic to see such a large and diverse audience with us this evening, and particular, while it's wonderful to see so many visitors, it's yet more wonderful to see so many students who have come to join us this evening for this talk. Should you require loo facilities, they are out of those doors there and to the left. And in the unlikely event that we need to evacuate the building in response to a fire alarm, we head in that direction. Well, there'll be plenty of people to show you the way, but our muster point is at the grass in the front of the main building, and we stay there until instructed to do so otherwise. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Sister Moira.
Thank you, Andrew. And it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome everybody here this evening on behalf of the community and to thank Newhall for their hospitality. It's great to have such a, as Andrew said, diverse group. The community age group is at one end and we've got lots of students at another. And when Maria's doing questions later on, we want to get a real mix of voices so the young people can hear the slightly older generation and vice versa. So welcome to everyone, and it's great to be together. And on behalf of everybody here, and particularly on behalf of the community, I'd like to formally welcome Dr. Reverend Liam Hayes this evening. Liam is the director of the I thought it's up there, yes, the Centre for Ecclesial Ethics at the Margaret Beaufort Institute in Cambridge. And this centre was established with the aim of enabling and equipping the church, both local church and universal church, to become a better church in the way it witnesses to the gospel. Liam is also a priest of our diocese here in Brentwood and works with CAFOD as its clergy and theology strategy advisor. Now, last year in March 2024, our diocese here in Brentwood published a document called Believing Not Belonging. And that was the result of a research project led by Liam into why so many Catholics no longer come to church. This was a piece of work commissioned by our Bishop, Alan Williams, and Liam invited a diverse group of Catholics to talk with him about why they no longer came to church. And Bishop Alan committed himself to listen seriously to their stories and their experiences to understand why that sense of belonging to the church didn't resonate for so many people today. And it's very appropriate that in this Jubilee year, as pilgrims of hope, we have the chance to listen to and take to heart the findings of Liam's research and face some of the difficult questions that our churches have to face today. Pope Francis recently spoke about conflict, and as part of what he said the following: conflict cannot be ignored or concealed. Conflict has to be faced. The best way to deal with conflict is the willingness to face it head on, to resolve it, and to make conflict a link in the chain of a new process. So we thank our bishop for his initiative and thank Liam for the piece of work which is encouraging all of us to face up to the conflicts that do exist in our churches today. I imagine that, like many of you, I went to see the film Conclave recently, and at one key moment in that film, one of the main characters said the following: "The church is not power. The church is not politics. The church is not tradition. The church is what happens next." And that what happens next isn't just the agenda for the bishop and for the clergy. It's a matter of urgent concern for all of us. So let all of us listen tonight with open minds and open hearts and pray that each of us can be a positive force in that what happens next. So Liam, you're very welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your warm welcome, and not least to Maura and the community for their kind invitation to contribute to this stimulating and thought-provoking Big Questions series. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, both in person and online, from across and beyond the Catholic Church, to those who feel they belong and to those who don't, and also especially to those of you from across the many Christian churches that enrich our communities and with whom we share a common baptism. There is much that we will share tonight that I'm sure you will find resonance with beyond and through our ecclesial walls. You're all most welcome. This evening, I'll be exploring the key question at the heart of our recent Believing Not Belonging research at the Centre for Ecclesial Ethics. A research that fundamentally asked one big question: why? Why do so many of our friends and family, colleagues and companions no longer come to church? Now, whilst the research was intentionally located within this Catholic Diocese of Brentwood, as we shall see and hear, the experiences and wisdom it reveals offers a pathway of hope, gift, and renewal to the many Christian churches present this evening. So why do so many of our friends and family, colleagues and companions no longer come to church? Why do more than 4 in 5, 82% of baptized Catholics in this diocese, no longer come to church? What has happened? It was time to reach out and ask, to extend a humble ear and begin to listen with some humility beyond the walls of our church and ask those no longer here, to understand why so many begin journeys of drift and estrangement, to uncover an understanding that offers our churches an opportunity to discern whether and how they might reform, renew, and reshape their praxis. What follows is something of what we heard, faithfully retold with neither fear nor favor. This is their witness and testament and narrative. These are the stories of those who still believe, but no longer feel as though they belong, that have meaning and implication for us all, well beyond the bounds of the Catholic Church. It's a narrative, as you'll hear, from the peripheries, that, as we shall see, strikes a resonant chord with the call of the Pope from the ends of the earth, a plea from parishioner and Pope for a church in which there is room for everyone, in which, as he says, no one is left out, in which all are welcome and appreciated just the way we are. Todos, 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 he said. Everyone, everyone, everyone. And why do we listen? We listen so we might hear, as the scripture reminds us so often, to what God's Spirit is saying to the churches. We listen because the Holy Spirit dwells and echoes within each and all of the baptized people of God, the common baptism we share as Christians, dwelling within you and I. We listen because Jesus listened, because Jesus reached out, as they say, to those outcast and excluded by religious authorities. We listen because it is constitutive of what it means to be a disciple, at the heart of our tradition, as they say, since before Jesus was a boy. Now, there's one question I ask you to keep in mind that we'll return to at the end of our evening together. If you were bishop for the day, whether of Brentwood, Chelmsford, or even Rome, what is the one change that you would make to the church? Hold that thought in your mind as we journey through the stories and experiences from our research and begin to understand why so many no longer come to church. What is the one change that you would make to the church? So what do we hear when we listen to those who yearn to believe and also belong? My faith has not wavered, I quote. My relationship with God will always be strong, but it's the judgment from the diocese and the church which needs to change, to become more inclusive of everyone. Churches must open their doors to all, not just to those defined specifically as practicing Catholics. Our first glimpse of the narrative we begin to hear when we listen with those who sit on the ecclesial peripheries rather than on our familiar church pews. Part of the experience that emerges when we listen beyond the walls from which so many are missing. This evening we'll be able to gain a deeper insight rather than a comprehensive immersion into the complex reasons why so many no longer come to church. For that, I invite you to see the full report from our research available on the Margaret Beaufort website and on the diocesan website too. This evening we'll gain a deeper insight into the rich repository of wisdom that women and men who are no longer present offer to our churches, who they are, the myriad reasons they tell for ecclesial separation, and the ecclesial ethical implications that emerge from our research for our churches. So who did we listen with? We hear the voices of almost 500 baptized Catholics, 370 of whom identified as non-practicing, of which 2/3 were female, 1/3 were male, and one person identified as other, and whose ages range from 18 to 64, with 70% coalescing between 35 and 65, and geographically spread across the county of Essex and northeast London. Almost 3/4 of the respondents still significantly regard themselves as believing, whilst not regularly practicing their faith in church. I attended Mass weekly, I quote, as I have done all my life, up until approximately 5 years ago, when I became disillusioned with the church and my attendance gradually declined. My faith remains strong, but I am disillusioned with the institution of the church. So it's not necessarily the faith of men and women that has shifted, but rather the shape and location in which it is expressed. A faith that is no longer regularly expressed within the church. A key research insight that is significant for us to keep in mind. So what do we really hear when we dig deeper? Well, the complexity of the stories and experiences that underpin such ecclesial estrangement and separation is noteworthy from the start. Many different factors often accumulatively contribute to a movement away from a regular practice of faith. But the many reasons and factors that we hear that contribute to separation can loosely be grouped under the following headings, some of which we shall explore in more detail shortly. There's a deficit in welcome and belonging, and a surplus of judgment and condemnation. Factors leading to separation. Alongside the joys and hopes and anxieties and griefs, the pattern and pressures of everyday life. The experience of COVID-19 and participants' experience of ecclesial and ethical discord that we shall explore in more detail shortly. This evening, we'll choose to look briefly at the deficit in welcome and a surplus of judgment, before focusing more forensically on the symptoms and causes of ecclesial and ethical discord, to which many became more attuned during COVID. So let's begin with welcome, or more accurately, its deficit. A church in which men and women do not feel welcome or appreciated or as though they belong was an experience shared by a significantly large number of people in the research and cited as a causal factor in their movement away from faith. I often feel unwelcome and unworthy to be here, said one. The church doesn't welcome people like myself. The priest is very negative, said another, and at times I often feel unwelcome. Indeed, over 53% of Catholics observed that they do not feel welcome or as though they belong in their parish. And 65% did not believe that the church was interested in what they think or believe. Instead of feeling welcome, one said, I have felt intimidated and judged for being new and not a regular familiar face. And another simply said, I no longer feel any comfort or joy attending Mass. The research suggests that when men and women consistently feel unwelcome, undervalued and ignored, when they experience judgment and condemnation or simply remain unseen by fellow parishioners and clergy, they eventually walk or drift away from engagement in such parish communities. And importantly for us, they find value, recognition, appreciation and love elsewhere. Now, underlying this prima facie reason of a deficit in welcome and belonging and hospitality, we begin to see that the research reveals a more complex web of deeper reasons why so many no longer come to church, that are perhaps familiar to each of us and our friends and family. There's a poverty of time amidst competing family and work commitments, health limitations, and caring responsibilities. Liturgical barriers of time and scheduling, entry requirements for sacramental programs, and the very human experiences of isolation, loneliness, invisibility and not fitting in, and even abandonment and neglect from an uncaring church. People cite reasons and journeys of change and reappraisal of faith and church through significant milestones and periods of transition, from adolescence through to movement to university, through divorce and remarriage, to more permanent changes in life that include trauma, suffering, loss, and death. Why am I no longer in church? My wife died, one respondent poignantly replied. Let's explore more deeply some of the experiences from which such discord arises for people. Discord that was more noticeable during the COVID-19 pandemic. The influence of COVID-19 upon the practice of faith has been far-reaching since the outbreak of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. Patterns continue to wax and wane, to ebb and flow to this day in different places and at different times. But the ubiquitous experience of COVID led not only to a break in habit, a change in the pattern of church attendance and the wider practice of faith for some, but also to a fundamental recalibration of their relationship with the wider church through a time of deep reflection, discernment, and reappraisal of priorities. The experience of COVID not only amplified much existing dissatisfaction and disillusionment with church, but for many served as a catalyst for ecclesial drift and estrangement. Half of all respondents reflected that COVID sped up my drifting away from the church, while just over a quarter observed that they couldn't go to Mass during COVID and they haven't returned since. But it is this time of deep reflection and reappraisal that was perhaps the most significant impact of COVID-19 that I draw your attention to this evening. For the enforced lockdown periods, you remember them, during the pandemic, led to a time of extended reflection and discernment through which many reassessed the purpose and meaning of life and their priorities. A time that Pope Francis reminded the world, standing in a rain-swept St. Peter's Square, was a time to choose what matters. The research suggests that many baptized Catholics engaged in precisely such a process of COVID discernment, to reflect upon the significance that faith and church occupied in their lives, not least in terms of their relationship with God, with the church, and the clergy. This reflection on the wider praxis of the church extended to an amplified awareness of many dysfunctional practices at the heart of church life that appear to have previously gone unnoticed or ignored. In a time of COVID, when you remember in the general population, we were more sensitive and attentive to the prejudice and discrimination experienced by both women and people of color. This research suggests that a similar growth in the awareness of ecclesial dysfunction was experienced by many Catholics and contributed to ecclesial estrangement and a movement away from a regular practice of faith. COVID made me think more and more, said one, about how I and others were treated like lepers within the church. Priests and nuns who had committed far greater sins, in my opinion, than being divorced by their husband, continued to participate fully within the life of the church. For these and others, this period of what I call COVID conscientization led to a rejection of their previous toleration of clerical misbehavior and expressions of clericalism, and a heightened awareness of the absence of women in normative positions of leadership, governance, and ministry, in contrast to the role before them that many women took on voluntarily across the churches during the acute phase of the pandemic. We'll return to some of these in more depth shortly. Now, there's much more to say about COVID and its impact upon practice and faith, not least upon physical and mental health, upon church closures and online liturgy and ministry. But in our time this evening, the key thing we might take away is that COVID importantly opened up a space of reflective reappraisal that gave a sharper focus and deeper significance to many of the existing expressions of ecclesial discord experienced by many in this research. Let's turn our attention to one example of such ethical ecclesial discord. Our focus here is the church's teaching on same-sex relationships and the accompanying discord and specific ethical dissonance that contributes to ecclesial estrangement for so many from this. Whilst the church teaching on birth control was cited by 52% as a reason for no longer going to church, alongside 51% for divorce and remarriage and 42% for abortion. It was the church's teaching on homosexuality that was cited by 47% of Catholics as a reason for distancing themselves from the church, and specifically drew the most significant attention in the open-ended narrative responses. Responses that more deeply reveal the painful dissonance between the integrated personal faith and lived experience of Catholics and their families, and their encounter with the ecclesial praxis and ethical teaching of the church in this area. The research uncovers a picture of men and women struggling to remain in the practice of their faith in light of church teaching on homosexuality that is strikingly discordant with their own lived experience of sexuality and sexual expression as human beings, and fosters for many a cognitive, ethical dissonance. Now, these narratives' responses were often stark and present uncomfortable reading for a church that espouses compassion, tenderness, and hospitality. Indeed, in response to how has it come about you no longer consider yourself Catholic, one person simply replied, "I am a gay man," with no further qualification apparently necessary. More responses revealed further seeds of discord, and they were equally troubling. I quote, "I grew up in a very active family within the Brentwood Diocese. We attended Mass weekly, were heavily involved. I loved the community and the sense of belonging. Unfortunately, who I choose to love does not follow the teachings of the faith. And so as to protect my family, I feel that to distance myself is a better option than to be who I am openly. I would love to return to the church, the community, the faith, but it doesn't feel like a place where I would be welcome, and I don't want to let my family down, so it's better to stay away." Whether being gay was a concern of the respondents themselves or of their children, the replies were often equally moving, yet confidently unapologetic in their reflection upon how it had influenced a movement away from the church. The love and acceptance received by gay Catholics from parents and friends often sharply contrasted with their experience of church teaching and clergy. "My eldest daughter," I quote, "has since come out as gay, and the official Catholic view that sees this as wrong sticks in my throat. She is a wonderful young lady who I am immensely proud of, caring and good. Why should she be made to feel wrong in some way?" Significantly from the research, and worthy of emphasis, the impact of this discord is no longer limited to the estrangement of those who are themselves gay, but extends to the parents, siblings, and friends of gay men and women across the church. Now, many of these respondents make a considered plea for the church to move away from what they described as old-fashioned ethical teaching, to adapt it and refine it in light of the world of today, to, I quote, "get with the times." A plea, it seems, to move away from teaching which is developed with little appeal to lived experience as a source of moral wisdom, to one which is informed by a more authentic and accurate anthropology of our understanding of what it means to be human, in which all people might see their face, hear their voice, and recognize their story. Otherwise, for many in the research, the church is no longer recognized as a credible voice to whom they should listen in their moral decision-making, in sexual ethics or further afield. The church's teaching on same-sex relationships and its accompanying pedagogy, alongside its teaching on divorce and remarriage, were important causative factors for a movement away from a regular practice of faith. So what of the ecclesial discord that also emerges from the research and uncovers further significant reasons that contribute to so many no longer coming to church? Well, the breadth and extent of ecclesial discord, cited as reasons leading to separation, was often manifest through ecclesial experiences of judgment, condemnation, and exclusion. This was highly significant in the influence it had upon ecclesial practice. And most notably, as will be seen, through a widely damaging experience of clericalism. Priests, bishops, and deacons forgetting, as Pope Francis puts it, the memory of their own baptism, behaving and living as if they were more important and significant than the non-ordained. And such ecclesial discord also arose from the significant ecclesial deficit regarding the recognition and role of women in the church and the clerical child sexual abuse scandal. So let's look at priesthood and clericalism first. Now, whilst there are many good and faithful priests who have and continue to serve across this diocese, it's far from universal experience of those who no longer go to church. And there are many expressions of clericalism that arise for participants here in Brentwood. But the following three emerge with the greatest frequency and most significance. There is the repeated and ongoing experience of judgment and condemnation by priests through both their preaching and their wider practice. The church, someone said, stopped being love and started being judgmental. Secondly, the experience of a clergy disconnected from the rhythm and rhyme of the life of the laity. The ecclesial estrangement of priests and people, one mysterious to the other. Clergy and people leading different lives, inhabiting, it seems, different worlds. The church, I quote, teaches from afar and is not down among us, supporting us at times of difficulty. The clergy are too far removed. It reminds me of a feudal system with people like me being the serfs of old. A far cry from Jesus of Nazareth and the field hospital advocated by Pope Francis. And thirdly, and quite importantly, an absence of effective structures and practices of accountability for the clergy that allowed them to behave with apparent impunity. As one contributor said, for they were accountable only to God. Women in the church. The diverse experience of women in the church was deeply troubling for many. And many women reflected that they do not see their face or hear their story, nor recognize their experience in the wider praxis of church life and ministry through an array of ongoing experiences that included an absence of audible and visible female voices in life and ministry across the church, a dismissive and disrespectful clerical attitude and relationship with women, a deficit in normative ecclesial engagement with the experience of women as a source of wisdom, and the church behaving in its teaching and praxis, I quote, as if the baptism of women is inferior to the baptism of men. Now, it's difficult to overemphasize the importance that is given to this issue. The deficit in the inclusion of women across church life, its leadership and ministry, is identified by many as a causal reason for estrangement. The church, I quote, is dying on its feet because women are excluded. My view is that if I'm not good enough to say Mass, I'm not good enough to arrange flowers or clean the church. It's a men's game, and we're preached to by a man who too often has no adult experience of getting along with children, a partner, or living in fear of losing the job. But without the contribution of women, very few parishes would survive. Many respondents also imagined a clear pathway out of this discord. I'd love to hear, said one, what a woman in the pulpit thought about the gospel or some moral issue. There is a serious need for change. Appoint women at every level. Ditch the robes, review the rituals. God really doesn't care about candles and embroidery on clothes, honestly. Make the church the community centers where all are welcome, really. The scandal of clerical child abuse within the Catholic Church and the subsequent episcopal cover-up casts a long shadow over the experience of church for many and constitutes the most grave set of reasons identified as contributing to ecclesial estrangement and intentional disaffiliation. This found expression in the direct experience of participants of clerical child abuse, both as individuals and in their immediate family. Also, the secondary and tertiary impact of such abuse across parish and wider Catholic community, from which 47% agreed that the incidence of such scandal in the church was a factor in their movement away. The scandal continued to entrench for many a deeper awareness of ecclesial hypocrisy and an experience of fractured trust. And the scandal compounded the diminished authority and credibility of the church and her leaders to teach and preach. This widespread awareness and experience of clerical child abuse in the church has left what appears to be a permanent imprint of an ecclesial scandal on the memory of many, an imprint that is reflected and recognized by many in their encounters with individual and structural ecclesial hypocrisy. This finds an influence not only upon no longer coming to church, but also upon a broader relationship with the church in which there's a fracturing of the fundamental bonds of trust and a diminishment of wider church authority. Religion should be about love, said one, not casting judgment and spreading hate. Given the horrific behavior of priests and officials that has been exposed, how dare the church cast judgment on anyone when this has been happening and covered up for so long? Ecclesial scandal cannot be underestimated with regards to the impact it has upon the practice of faith and why so many no longer come to church. Now, there is so much more that the research reveals with regards to the big question as to why so many no longer go to church. Many reasons that have contributed to estrangement, restricted participation, diminished communion, and weakened mission, all in the context of a world hungry for justice and goodness. So what have we learned? And what might it mean for all our churches across these islands and beyond, not least in this Jubilee year of hope? Let me leave you with some ecclesial ethical implications that can point to a new way. Implications that I hope might also provoke and inform your thinking about the one change that you would like to make to the church. Now, in the full report for those who need a cure for insomnia, I focus attention on 20 or so ecclesial ethical implications that emerge for our churches from the research. But in the time remaining, I want to draw your attention to a few of these implications for what it means for us to be a good and better church. Those who believe, who no longer belong nor come to church, continue to long and yearn, like the psalmist dear, for a church in God's style. The people from the peripheries finding a rather poetic and significant ecclesiological resonance with the Pope from the ends of the earth, who calls for a church that does not stand aloof from life, but immerses herself in today's problems and today's needs, bandaging wounds and healing broken hearts with the balm of God. A church, as Francis says, in God's style of closeness, compassion, and tender love. Ecclesial belonging and welcome. Welcome and a sense of belonging are critically important for a flourishing ecclesial community. When men and women feel unwelcome, undervalued, and even invisible, they are less likely to remain present in the life of the church. When Catholics feel judged and condemned through the teaching of the church and the praxis of her priests, they tend to leave and not return. A church of imposed teaching. Many experience the church's ethical teaching as an imposition rather than an invitation to support and guide them in their journey of discipleship. There's an emergent underappreciation of the church's own teaching with regards to the primacy and dignity of personal conscience in the process of moral decision-making. An accurate and authentic anthropology is cried out for, that is attentive to the diverse experience of all the baptized people of God. And it's imperative for the ethical teaching of the church to retain or recover a position of significance and relevance in the moral decision-making of men and women. Many today no longer see their face, hear their voice, or recognize their story in the teaching and wider praxis of the church. They often leave. Ecclesial trust, integrity, and credibility. Fractured bonds of ecclesial trust and the diminished credibility of church leaders is present in many stories of those who no longer go to church. Trust and integrity matter to Catholics today. When it doesn't seem to matter to church leaders, people leave. A priest-centric church. A priest-centric church can hinder and frustrate the participation of the wider baptized. The practices and structures that shape our communities we see as significantly dependent upon the character, the disposition, and the outlook of the priest. And it's noticed that the arrival of a new priest can significantly change the orientation and focus of a parish with little or no consultation. The appointment of new priests has a significant impact upon patterns of affiliation and practice. And Catholics are aware that they have no voice or contribution to the episcopal process of clergy appointments. Catholics long and need to see women participating across all areas of church life. A deficit in the participation of women contributes to and compounds dysfunctionality in church life. A church with quietened women's voices and neglected women's experience is a poorer church. And finally, participative governance. Catholic men and women in this research expect transparent processes of governance and decision-making to oversee and guide the lives of local parish and diocesan communities. They withdraw from communities whose governance is opaque and unaccountable. There are many more ecclesial ethical implications that emerge from our research, from the experience and wisdom of those who no longer come to church. Why do so many of our friends and family, colleagues, companions, and neighbors no longer come to church? Perhaps it appears that our church's embrace of the God-given dignity of each and every human person, the baptismal dignity of each and all of the people of God, is too inconsistently upheld, promoted, and treasured in its own operant practices and structures. This evening, it's been possible to offer a glimpse of the challenging yet authentic narrative that emerges when we begin to listen attentively beyond the familiarity of the pews. A narrative that has shed light upon a people who have paused to reflect and discern amidst the COVID pandemic, and who have become estranged from a church in which they no longer see their face nor recognize the voice of Christ. Pope Francis in Amoris reminds us that each crisis has a lesson to teach us, and that more importantly, we need to learn how to listen for it with the ear of the heart. Because from such deep and attentive listening, a new and richer narrative emerges that I passionately believe can inform and inspire a different, renewed church that expands not only the space, but also the shape of its tent, so that there is room for everyone, in which each and all might believe and also belong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's given us all plenty to ponder, I'm sure. We're now going to enter into a time of questioning. I'm hoping there will be a lot of questions that Liam is very happy to answer. So if you do have a question, please do raise your hand and I will come to you with the microphone. church were to make changes that all of the people that have left have brought forward, do you think the people that were currently in the church would change and like leave the church, or do you think that they would like change their opinions along with what the church did?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So I think it's something about if the church did make all the changes that the people who have left are asking for, would it change, if you like, the perspective of the people that remain in the church now? Yeah. I think what's interesting, so you provoke a scenario in my head of what Pope Francis calls encounter. And it's in that encounter that our imagination is stretched and we hear and we listen the stories of each other and we begin to change. So, they make an appeal on us. When I hear your story and you hear my story, we engage, we enter into a relationship in that space and we begin to change. We no longer are the same again. Now, sure, there'll be some people who might leave and say, this is no longer my church. I can't predict, but I guess I suppose in the space, it's about those who have left, it's about those who remain, but it's also about God and the Spirit in the midst of these encounters that begins to stretch our imagination, as long as we're open-hearted and generous. And if I believe I know everything about every possible thing in the world, I'll be a very dull person and I'll be dead. Every day I wake up and I learn something new about what it means to be human, and I learn something new about God every day. And I think we learn that in our encounters with each other. So I think the answer to your question is what an extraordinarily rich church that would be. And it might be, I think as Maura was saying at the beginning, one, it doesn't need to be we all know from our family life, right? What it looks like around the dinner table and the rows and the conversations that happens, but we remain family. And so I think Pope Francis has done it across his time and his papacy, that far better to have disagreements above the earth and out loud than it is, subterranean. When they're out in the air and the oxygen breathes, the Spirit is amongst it, and it begins to change and stretch us and make us different. And I think that would be my prayer and hope. Thank you for your question. That's a very good question. What would you like to happen next? If I can just, I mean that genuinely in the sense that, and we'll probably come on to that, what are the changes that people want to see? It's I want to say it's above my pay grade, but it's not. I straddle both worlds of research and priesthood. And there are priests in this diocese who are interested in this, and there are laymen and women who are interested in this. So I'm open to your thoughts about what should happen next, strategically. What are the practical things out of this research? And there are many of them that can happen without the change in teaching, for example. Because welcome, for example, seemed to be something really significant in this research. And people don't feel welcome. They go to places where they do. And if you look what happens on a Sunday morning for so many younger people now, that involves sport. And you look at what happens, we were talking beforehand, on sporting fields, up and down the touchline on a Sunday morning. If we take the language aside when they're cheering their respective teams, but there's a sense of community. There's a sense of people getting to know each other. There's a sense of people relying on each other, looking out for each other beyond the confines of that football, hockey, rugby pitch that goes on. So what are we doing to learn and to listen and to understand that it is about that welcome that we need to embed in our church communities that we seem to have lost? So, I'll be very interested to hear if there's what you think should happen next with the research, because it's almost, so one of the interesting things that's come out, which I didn't mention, where it talks about over half of the practicing Catholics who say they go to church more than once a week, they say that their spiritual needs are not being met by the church. So what does that mean? It's an extraordinary thing to say about the church, because if the church isn't any good at meeting the spiritual needs of people, what on earth is it doing? The other thing which is interesting is this ecclesial strangers. The lives of priests are mysterious to most people, and the lives of people tend to be mysterious to most priests. So I'm trying to do a piece of work of bringing priests and people and religious together to actually begin to tell our stories and to live in the same space. You know, so there are two or three things, but I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on what could happen next. So thank you.
So I'm not a Catholic. I've had a lot of experience in churches and not a Catholic. My experience of the priesthood is the hot priest in Fleabag and conclave.
Mhm.
And I'm going to tell you, and I know that the hot priest in Fleabag, which touched, I think, a lot of people for lots of reasons, but he is a man of faith and he is a man of humility. He is broken, he makes mistakes, but actually in popular culture, you presented a warmer representation of your church than walking into a church.
Yeah.
And played by a gay man, just interestingly.
Yep.
But I didn't go, that to me was a church I could be part of.
Mm.
Whereas a lot of my experience when I have been in Catholic churches is in a large, empty, cold buildings with a lot of ceremony.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thankfully, I'm neither the hot priest from Fleabag and I'll never be in conclave. So blessed on both counts, probably. But I think if let's move to Fleabag because it's quite interesting. And what do we see there? We see a human being. We see a human being who is a priest, struggling to be a human being, struggling to be a priest, very real and connected with people. I had a period of illness maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. And in that period of illness, I felt far more connected to people who were also ill. Because all the niceties of life and we try and smarten yourself and all of that broke down. So you're connected when the barriers break down in our vulnerability, in our capacity to be vulnerable, not precarious, but vulnerable. We become affective human beings who can engage. And I think that's what God does in the incarnation, is plants God's self amongst us so that we might become like God and relate and touch heart to heart with each other. And that's been at the heart of the pontificate of Francis, as it has many popes beforehand, but more importantly, it's at the heart of the ministry of Jesus. And so you're right in that sense, and that comes out in the research really, really strongly. People are longing and yearning, not just, I would say, for the priests to be human, but also for their fellow Christians to be fully human too. What was fascinating about the synod that the church has just gone through is that so many people said, I've sat in this church for 25 years, and I've seen that man over there, and he sits in the same space, and we nod to each other, and I don't know his name. And that is beginning to change when we tell our stories and we become vulnerable with each other as God becomes vulnerable with us through Jesus. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They are everywhere and they are running everything, and we need alternatives.
Yeah, and the church is a counter to a prevailing alternative in the world at the moment. And I think, and the gospel does that, and the church's mission always and everywhere, in and out of season, is to reflect that. And do you know, and there are many, I mean priests, many broken men, many good guys, and there are many bad guys. You can see that as well, right? So I think, but it's a church of men and women together. And I think when we accept that, we have a stronger witness to the gospel of Jesus, which is really where we're at. That's what matters, not the church. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a great piece of work. I think it's a job that's only half done. Because I think the important question is one that came first, which is what's next. And I think and that poses two questions, I guess. How do you persuade the hierarchy, if I use that as a general word, that change has to take place if the church is going to become more popular and more inclusive? And I think that needs to recognise that the church needs to be a two-way process. That the people who attend church need to feel that they're able to contribute to the mass, perhaps the ceremony, and the whole process. It is very much, as you pointed out, you're talked to, you're told what to do, what you can't do, and lots of people feel that that's not acceptable in modern society. And I'd like to hear how you think you can take it forward. It's plan to do so. I think it's an important second half of the work.
Yeah, and I think the research, I mean, it was the summer of 2023, so it was in the midst of the synod, okay? And so the synod, it's not a panacea for everything, but it changes the way we think and imagine church. So it's not, Francis in his thing about clericalism, his definition is fascinating. When priests forget the memory of their baptism, the most important thing for me, I'm a human being, then I was baptized. Only then was I ordained, and that means priesthood for me is how I am a Christian. And it's actually the baptism that we each share as the people of God that is most significant. So our structures and practices, in answer to your question, need to change to reflect that. Our theology is extraordinary, right? So the theology of baptism is the most extraordinary thing we have in one sense. So how do we change our practices? How do we celebrate baptism? We put so much into ordination and, not a problem with that. But baptism, how do we celebrate that across the Christian church? And that ontological change. So how would you do it? I would say that people should get together and converse and chat about how we make a good and better church in the place that we occupy, because that's what we can do and that's what we are responsible for because of our baptism. And that means the priest as part of that conversation. Take your priest out for a pint. Honestly, take him out for a meal. If he says no, fine, but ask him. Take him out for a pint. And then when he's on his third pint, have the good conversation. Write to Alan, write to the bishop. Ask him. Take him for a pint, your loved one. But ask him about, this is the research, these are the findings which you commissioned. What can we do together about it to make a good and better church, to bring this radical gospel of Jesus Christ to our world today that is in so much need of it? So I think the agency is with us. Now, I get the structures aren't all in place, but we have to break them somewhere. To make an omelette, you've got to break a few eggs. So
Is there a process in place to do it?
at present, so I don't necessarily think there is, but then I think we can begin crafting it. So wherever you are, I think there is responsibility and agency that you have to begin to do something. Now, that can be quite difficult if the gatekeeper, the priest, says no, and I understand that. However, that doesn't mean that you can't pray together, that you can't gather together, that you can't think strategically about what our community looks like, how we connect with others of like mind. And it's a lot harder work when the structures are against you. And I think that's true. But we do have the agency and we do have the authority. And that's changing with the synod. Every parish will have to have a parish council. The bishops will have to report to Rome every 5 years about what they're doing about synod in their own diocese. They will be held accountable. And it's up to us to tell priests, no, you are accountable. We need to stop perhaps being, dare I say, as a priest, so deferential to the clergy. And I know many priests share that as well. So there's I don't have all the answers, by the way, at all. I think the answers are definitely here amongst us and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you. At the start of your address, you made a comment which actually just registered with me. Somebody said to you that my faith is not reflected in the church. It made me think, well, everyone here must have different ideas of what faith is. And I don't doubt that when you did your research, you must have looked at what does the church teach about faith so that there can be a balanced view on that. And then I started to ask myself, why do people go to church? Is it because they're faith driven? Is it because that they're looking for something that they can't find outside the church, spirituality of the church, whatever it happens to be, or the community of the church? But I base my question to you on what is faith, and no doubt you would have looked at it in your research.
It's an excellent question, and thank you, because of course the flip side of this, why do so many people no longer come to church? Well, why do people still come to church? And what is it about? So I suppose your question, what is faith and what is church? And there's quite a diverse spectrum of that. People will answer it in very different ways. And I suppose faith might mean about their relationship with God, relationship with Jesus Christ, relationship with a wider ecclesial community. It might be, so all of those things, it might be. And there are many definitions. I mean, really conference upon conference could actually respond to your question. But I suppose what is interesting, what is at the heart of faith that that sustains people who are still connected? And what's interesting is then people who say they are people of faith, but no longer people of church, and how that faith is sustained as well. So I don't have a direct answer. I mean, there are so many answers to your question, what is faith? But I think it sits with what is church and what sustains the faith of people who no longer are in church. And I suggest from the research that's talking about scripture and their relationship with Jesus and their picture of who Jesus is and what he means for their life and their community. But what does that look like when it's not nurtured or supported by other Christians in that community? So, and then for those who remain in the church, what is it about this space that keeps them and attracts them? And the reasons for remaining are as many as the reasons for leaving, I would suggest. And often the converse, that sense of human connectedness that came up during COVID as being so significant for many people is what people find in the Christian community and what they find also elsewhere, say on the rugby pitch or in other secular organizations as well, that sense of community. We were talking about the biggest mass gatherings in this country at the moment are sports events. Still, when people gather, renew relationships and sing. Sounds familiar. But it's an ongoing question, and maybe a future piece of research is that what makes people remain in church today? How does their faith sustain those who don't? But how does faith and church belonging, why are you still there? What makes you come? Thank you. Hi.
Do you think that one of the reasons why people don't feel like they're in a community or that they're not receiving as much support is because, in a way, the Catholic Church is too rigid and too traditional that if you wanted to just relax and maybe let your guard down a bit more, there's no space to do that compared to other denominations, because I feel like I've been to many different types of churches, and the problems that I'm hearing today, I haven't really seen for example, I grew up going to Pentecostal churches and it's more relaxed, and I feel like people's spiritual needs are met more because they can be relaxed.
Okay. Can I just ask, just to clarify that sense of, do you think people leave because of the rigidity of the Catholic Church in contrast to the relaxed nature of other Christian churches? I suppose, so the research suggests that there's rigidity in terms of liturgy for some people. So the way we celebrate for some people, and there's across the spectrum. For some, it's too traditional. For some, it's too informal. I suppose it depends where you are. But for others, there's a sense of rigidity in teaching, as we've seen. So the teaching that doesn't reflect necessarily the experience of all people who would come to church or their family and friends. Their face, their voice, their story is not heard in that, what it means to be human in their thinking. And also in the way we organize ourselves. We're pretty priest-led in the Catholic Church, and this priest-centric way of doing things. And so is there a way that can be reshaped and renewed whilst respecting priesthood and baptism at the same time, that makes it more informal or more welcoming for people to participate? Be interesting to hear more afterwards, perhaps, what are the barriers that you specifically see for people to feel more relaxed in the Catholic Church? What specifically happens? What are those specific instances? So maybe we can chat afterwards about that as well. Thank you.
People making eyes at me to say, I have a question. I think for time purposes, we have time for one more question, and perhaps if you're around afterwards, people can
Sure.
talk to each other and talk to you.
I had thought coming here that you might be addressing the question of the very, what I perceive as a very aggressive secularism, which is we're bombarded with all the time, and which people of faith, whatever faith they are bombarded with. But the question that I had wanted to ask was, I noticed, although you left out the bit about liturgy, which obviously is in your work, but the fact that we are a Eucharistic, I'm a Catholic rather than a Quaker or whatever, because we are a Eucharistic community. And for me, everything, you said that baptism was ontological, but for me, everything springs from the Eucharist, which obviously springs from baptism. So there's kind of two parts to my question. Thank you, Belinda.
Okay, thank you. And is there a specific, can I just clarify your specific question for me?
Okay, well, I think it might be more useful for you to perhaps comment on the, as I've got two parts to the question, comment on how we're bombarded, in my view, with a very aggressive secularism, atheism, or whatever. I'm confessing this before a large audience, but one of my most frequent sins, if you like, when I do go to confession, is how intolerant I am of atheists.
So I think the world in which we live, so the world, the church exists in the world, and in the world there is much good. God is not confined to the church or the churches, not least the Catholic Church. We find God in many spaces and in many people. And so the church is in this relationship with people and the world, and to try to understand and uncover what it means to be good in the space that we occupy. Now, we were talking beforehand about a tension between the pattern of culture and life today and pattern and culture of faith, and how each has something to learn from the other. So something about Sabbath we were talking about might actually offer some meaning and some rest and renewal in a 24/7 fast-paced world in which we have no space. So faith communities have something to contribute to a world that is exhausted and a planet that is clearly exhausted and fragile, when, more is clearly a mantra that deep down very few of us continue to subscribe to. And I think also there are different ways of gathering, connecting, relating, being and organizing together that the churches and faith can learn from as well. So I think this conversation, this reciprocity is probably where I would take it, that is most significant. And it comes from the research. You hear people say, I know goodness stems from the gay friends that I have. I understand that. And there's this tension between what the church is saying and what people experience in their daily lives. And they're trying to make sense of that and resolve that dissonance. So it's not always conflict. There's often some kind of rich conversation and dialogue that can happen between faith and culture, because we're embedded in that world. So I hope that helps.
Well, unfortunately, you have to draw this to a close. And first of all, thank you so much, Liam, for this absolutely mind-blowing presentation. You've raised so many questions. You brought us such a rich view of what the possibilities are for renewal in the church. And you've certainly touched some of our hearts, and you've brought us some insights that are going to both nourish our faith, if that's where we are, but also perhaps enable us to share our understanding of what is going on in the church today and what the church of the future might look like if, as Catholics, we can focus a little bit more on being welcoming. So I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking Liam again and wishing him all the best for all the work he's doing, not just in this for tonight, but also within the diocese. Thank you so much.